Hi, I'm Guitar George. We spoke briefly about a guitar setup and an introduction to what a setup is. Now I'm going to look at the tools that you're going to need to do the job if you want to do it at home. And first thing you're going to want is somewhere to work. When I'm set up, I've got a workbench. What I have on my bench is a piece of plywood, and I've covered this with a section of camping foam roll mat, and on top of that an ironing board cover pinned all the way around, so it's a nice flat cushioned surface so I can put any guitars on that and I'm not going to do any damage whatsoever. The other thing I use is a neck block. You can get these from various places. It means when the guitar sits on the bench I'm not resting it on its headstock. So somewhere nice and cosy to work that's not going to damage the guitar at all. Since the first thing I'm going to assess is the straightness of the neck, I need something to check it against. Well, there are two ways to do that. The best way is with a notched straight edge. There we go. It's got notches underneath that will sit over the top of the frets. Two scale lengths, Gibson and Fender basically. So this will sit on the guitar and I can then tell exactly how straight the neck is. I can measure the straightness by measuring the gap between the face of the fretboard and the bottom of the straight edge using an engineer's feeler gauge. This set are imperial because a lot of the most of the big guitar manufacturers are American based. Any figures you see quoted for guitar setup tend to be in feet and inches. So I can measure the gap using those. The other way you can do it is to use a capo, put that on at the first fret, and then by playing the string up at the last fret using the string as a straight edge I can see the gap between the strings and the tops of the frets, again measuring with an engineer's feeler gauge. Not necessarily so accurate because it doesn't take into account if you've got any uneven frets. Next thing of course I'm going to want to do is, if the neck isn't straight enough or it's too flat, is to physically adjust the truss rod. Take the capo out of the way. And it's a screw, it's down at the end of the neck, down in here. So the most obvious thing, set of Allen keys. Again, pick these up from any engineering store. However, I don't necessarily like them. Sometimes this end just isn't quite long enough to get into the pocket at the end of the neck to get hold of the string. Likewise, if you're going with a long end, you can't quite get enough leverage with this to turn the truss rod. Likewise, since most guitars are American, you might find you also need a set of imperial wrenches. However, you probably might well have those knocking around. I use these. It's a proprietary made. It's meant specifically for the job. It's got a nice big tough handle with my hex end, but it's a slightly ball end, so I can get different angles at it and I can get onto the truss rod adjustment. Of course, you'll also find some guitars, particularly Gibsons and Rickenbackers, that the end of the truss rod adjustment is an actual hex nut. So you might need a box spanner on the end of a wrench that will actually get in there. Likewise, you might find these sorts of things are just as useful. It's a box spanner with a nice little handle on it. They're quite useful, nice for getting onto the end of truss rods. So once you've done that, we're going to need to adjust the bridge. Well, the bridge on this guitar is what we call a tune-o-matic. So the height is adjusted either side of the bridge with a small thumb wheel. They're very difficult to turn because of the pressure of the string holding them down. The tension in there is quite stiff. There are two ways of going at that. First, you could use one of these. It's a sort of V-shaped wrench. It's got teeth on one side, so you can grip nicely for undoing, or then teeth on the other side for doing those thumb wheels up. It's useful, but I don't like this. It's a little bit harsh and you can actually damage the thumb wheels quite easily with these things if it's too tight. So the other way going about it is one of these. It's a strange sort of spoon shaped little lever, padded at the back, and you can slide this neatly underneath the tune-o-matic bridge, very gently lever the bridge upwards, and then it allows you to just turn the thumb wheels easily. course, when you're doing that, you need to adjust the height of the string. So I'll need my capo again at the first fret, and then this is my string action gauge. It's a small rule with very fine little figures. If you look very closely down this side, it's calibrated in 64ths of an inch, which is the sort of accuracy I need to go to measure my string actions. Once we've done the guitar at this end, of course I need now to sort out the playing action at the first fret of the nut. As I've said, this one has got a new nut in it, so the action is very, very high. And I'm going to measure the playing action again with my engineer's feeler gauges, just sliding those under at the first fret. Since they're way too high, I need to cut the slots down deeper in the nut. Well, you could use a fine needle file, but trying to eyeball it is going to be very tricky. So what I've got a set of about half a dozen of these things, nut files. They're shaped so that the file itself has a rounded bottom and a V, so that the slot is cut down nicely, V-shaped, with a nice round bottom, and they're matched specifically, the diameter of this file to the diameter of the string, so that the string sits in a perfectly shaped slot. And the other thing I find useful is this little bilio here, useful for getting the strings out of the slots. It's important that when you're cutting these the slots, that you do it with all the strings fitted at tension, otherwise the setup of the guitar is going to change. They're very helpful for just popping underneath the string and levering the string up and out of the way when you're I can get into the slot without having to take all the tension off the strings. With most of the setup done that way, now I would be looking at the intonation. These are standard screws, so any small screwdriver set to get into the heads of the screws there is fine. Whatever you find is comfortable. But you will need a good accurate tuner. These sorts of things, yeah, sitting on the end of the guitar head, they're great for just playing, but they're not exactly very accurate. What I use sits in the workshop is a rack mounted tuner. This thing is accurate to 1/1000th of a semitone, way more than the human ear can possibly detect. And if you're setting up the accuracies of intonation, you do need something good and accurate. Lastly, then, I'm going to look at pickup heights. Well, I could just use my action gauge to measure the distance between the pole piece on the pickup and the bottom of the string, or I've got a set of these. They're fine brass feeler gauges. They're designed specifically for the job, so they've got standard Fender and Gibson settings. And I can put these in between the string and the pole piece because they're brass, they're non-ferrous, they're not going to affect the magnets on the strings at all, or in the pickups rather. So there we are, that's the sort of equipment you might find you'll need or you want to do a setup. Otherwise, check out my website www.guitar-george.co.uk. Have a good day.